Now we're going to talk about situations where you'd call on the flop with nothing with the intent of stealing the pot later. All the kids today, they call it floating. Okay? Now in most heads-up situations, neither you nor your opponent will hit the flop with a very strong hand. The player who is able to get the best of the situations where neither of you have much of anything after the flop is usually the player that will come out ahead in the long run. There are several ways to approach these types of situations, but there is one particular way of stealing pots from your opponent that is low risk with a high success rate and fits the mold of the small ball approach. When you are in position against just one opponent, what you have is often unimportant. Instead, what's important is the strength of your opponent's hand. Let's look at a couple examples. With blinds at 100, 200, and a 25 ante, a player raises to 600 from late position, and you call him from the button with 10 jack of hearts while all others fold. The flop comes ace, 9, deuce. Now your opponent bets 800, about half the pot. Normally in this situation, folding would be the best option since you've completely missed the flop and your opponent could easily have the ace. Or maybe not. Suppose your opponent had any of the following hands: pocket sevens, king, queen, pocket tens, or 9-10. He may very well bet any of these hands after the flop, but if you were to call or raise him, he'd likely fold as he could only beat a bluff. If you do decide to make a play at the pot, smooth calling is actually a slightly better play than raising on the flop, especially since that's what you would normally do anyway if you had a hand like ace-jack or ace-queen. The other reason that smooth calling is a better play in this specific situation is because you actually have a hand that could turn into a monster draw with the turn of a card. An 8 or a queen would give you an open-ended straight draw, and a heart would give you a backdoor flush draw. So let's say you make the call on the flop. By the turn, you should have a much better idea as to the strength of your opponent's hand. If he bets, you should probably just give it up. Unless, of course, you've improved your hand by catching a queen, 8, or a heart, and the bet's not too big. If you happen to hit a straight or a flush on the river, and your opponent has, say, a set of aces, the payoff could be huge, since he'll have a difficult time putting you on a straight when the board came ace, 9, deuce, rainbow. What about, though, if your opponent checks on the turn, appearing to put up the white flag? With about 3,000 in the pot, you could bet about 1,500 and pick it up. Not always, of course, as a trickier player may decide to either check raise on the turn or possibly even be happy to check call. The thing is, this play doesn't need to work even half the time to make it profitable, since you're making sure to keep your bets small, thus giving yourself a good price on the bluff attempt. In this case, you'd be risking 1,500 on the turn to win 32.25, which is better than 2-to-1 odds that your opponent will fold. Of course, if you factor in the 800 call on the flop, that lessens your odds to something like 2,300 to win 32.25. However, that's not entirely true either, as you'll only be risking 800 when your opponent bets the turn, and if you improve to a draw on the turn, you could potentially win a lot more. Let's look at another example where you have a two-way play on the flop. 25-50 at the blinds, and your opponent has made it 150 to go from early position. Everyone else folds except you, calling on the button with 6-4 hearts. The flop comes king 7-3 with 1 heart. With 375 in the pot, your opponent bets out 300. Now all you have is an inside straight draw, and you aren't really sure what your opponent has at this point. In one sense, you hope that he has aces or even kings, but on the other hand, if he has a hand like ace-queen, that's not too bad either. Calling on the flop with this gut-shot straight draw will actually give you 2 ways to win the pot. The most obvious way is to nail the straight on the turn, but the other way is to take control of the hand with a bet on the turn. If your opponent does have aces, kings, or even ace-king, a 5 on the turn will look like a completely innocent card. In fact, if your opponent has pocket kings, he will think that he has the absolute nuts. Based on that alone, it's often worth calling to try and hit the straight because the potential payoff is so huge. Well, that situation isn't going to happen very often, but that's okay because you can always fall back on plan B. If your opponent raised with ace-queen, queens, jacks, ace-jack, or several other hands, he may be afraid of your call on the flop, thinking that you must have a king. If your opponent checks the turn, you can often pick up the pot with a bet of, say, 600. 600 to win 975 with the added bonus of still having an out if you get called. Now, things change dramatically when you're out of position as you lose control of the betting and don't get information about your opponent's hand on the turn to make this play profitable in the long run. In position, you get the benefit of seeing your opponent either check or bet before having to act. Out of position, this calling with nothing on the flop play doesn't work nearly as well. Let's look at an example. The flop comes king 7-8, and you are out of position with jack 9. Your opponent bets the flop and you call. The turn is a 4 and you check again. This time your opponent checks too. Now, had the positions been reversed, you could have bet this turn card in the hopes of stealing it. You do get one more chance to steal this pot on the river, though, but by then the play is much less effective. Based on the way you played your hand, if you bet the river card, your opponent will call you with a wide variety of hands since you showed no real aggression up until then. Plus, there are several draws on the board that you may have missed. If, for example, your opponent had pocket queens, he would call your bet on the river a very high percentage of the time. In fact, he may call you with as little as ace high. The power of position allows you to take control of a hand like this and keep the heat on your opponent who can't be sure that he won't be facing yet another large bet on the river. With marginal hands out of position, you should be able to force an opponent off a hand if you play your cards right. The key to this play working for you is that it has to be believable, as in you would play a strong hand the same way as you're playing this hand. With a small ball approach to the game, you'll routinely be smooth calling with top pair, middle pair, sets, gut shots, over pairs, and all sorts of hands, which will make it easy to sell the idea that when you call on the flop, it does not signify weakness at all. That will allow you to exploit your opponents, even if they know what you're doing. Seriously, the beauty of this approach to playing on the flop is that even if your opponents know that you like to smooth call with all sorts of hands, they couldn't know when you have the strong hand and when you are calling with nothing. Their defense against this sort of play is minimal since they'll be forced to play the guessing game.